You are listening to Texas History Lessons, a slow walk through Texas history made in Texas by a Texan for everyone everywhere.
A Texan's Guide to Life. If there were a Texan's Guide to Life, where would you expect to find it? Now, there's a humorous Texan's Guide for Life listing about 20 lines of advice on the internet. A joke page. Golden gems like don't squat with your spurs on and never miss a good chance to shut up. And honestly, not some bad advice there. Maybe I should copyright the phrase Texan's Guide to Life. Aside from it and a variety of guides on how to be a Texan, I don't know of one existing, but I expect it might exist in one of the great libraries or bookstores across the Lone Star State if it did, because Texas has been home to many a great writer and has been written about by many more that have looked at it from the outside. If one existed, it would probably be by one of these good folks that have put pen to paper while pondering the possibilities of pursuing a profound and protracted life. Books are important for many reasons, and this would be a pretty important book. And don't just take my word for it. John Milton agreed, saying, "A good book is the precious lifeblood of a master's spirit." And that leads me to another question or two that opens up a big can of debate. Who are the best known Texas authors? I could ask, who's the best Texas author? And that is a rabbit hole I can't even begin to drop down into. There are too many possibilities, and matters of taste are matters of bias. But who are the best-known Texas writers and authors of all time? Shouldn't be too hard to get a top 5 or a solid top 10. My unscientific guesstimate is that there are about 3 or 4 Texas writers that would be at the top of a scientific poll to answer that question. Ones that you can find in most Texas bookstores, or that quite a few folks would name if asked that question. The easiest selection is Larry McMurtry, forever ingrained in the good Texans literary canon by his 1985 novel Lonesome Dove, along with several other classic works. I would hope that some would mention one of my favorites, Elmer Kelton. His best writing stands equal or better to anything many ever did. Now, that's a personal bias, and I mention him because I want him to be on the list. Another favorite is John Graves, but I don't know whether a poll of people would get him on the list. I hope they both would make it, but again, that's my obvious bias. Another no-brainer is T.R. Fehrenbach. He was a heck of a writer, and his 1968 Lone Star is, to the dismay of many a good Texas historian, undeniably the best-selling history of Texas ever published. A novelist I respect for the quality of his writing and storytelling has a couple of times recommended Lone Star as the best history of Texas. Now, I don't give his name because I don't want to single him out for criticism. His opinion is his opinion, and he thinks it's the best, and therefore he's entitled to share that with whoever he wants to. There are several historians that could share their own heated opinions as to why it's not the best. In 2018, one respected historian named Ty Cashin published a book titled Lone Star Mind, and in it he dedicates a lot of ink or digital pixels on e-readers, explaining the many conceptual deficiencies of the romantic and mythic narrative the book has served to codify since its first publication in 1968. No matter which side of the divide you fall on, best history versus just flawed and deficient best-selling history, Fehrenbach does deserve to be on the list. One thing I appreciate Fehrenbach for is that despite whatever flaws historians can find in Lone Star, there's a lot that he seems to have gotten right, at least in his forewords. In the 1968 foreword, he wrote something that is still true. Quote, "The state is so wide and varied and so rich in ceaseless action that the student trying to grasp the feel and meaning of Texas's place in American history is often baffled." End quote. He also recognized that a, quote, "problem facing every Texan historian contemplating a Texan readership is that all nations have their nationals myths. and Texas became enough of a nation within a nation to formulate its own. Many of Texas's legends, historically unproven and even historically insupportable, are fondly held and fiercely defended. This is not unique to Texas. The American nation has its own mythology, end quote. Now, Fehrenbach also quoted a historian that I'm about to be talking a little bit about here in the near future, Walter Prescott Webb, an author and historian that would probably be in the top 10 of the list. Webb's words are wise. He said, "The historian whose work is to stand the test must deal with facts as if they were remote, with people as if they were no longer living, with conditions as they are or were and not as they should have been." Fehrenbach followed that quote by saying, "I am a Texan, but I have deliberately tried to write about Texans in this book as if they were Frenchmen or Chinese." Whether he succeeded in accomplishing that goal is a matter of hot debate also. No matter, the book stands the test of time in capturing the dominant Anglo-Texans' views and opinions that held sway for decades, until faced with revisionist history not long after Lone Star's first printing, and for that reason, it is still worthwhile. Plus, as I said before, Fehrenbach was a heck of a writer. But I digress from my original focus. Some could possibly argue that the Rhode Island-born and Tennessee-raised Cormac McCarthy should be on the list based on the fact that he lived in Texas for some time and wrote some of his best works here. He lived in El Paso, and that might raise a question as to whether he really lived in Texas, and that's a debate for another day. There are some other personal favorites. O. Henry lived here for a time. Paulette Giles is a great Texas writer I love. Stephen Harrigan, Derek Jeter, John Willingham, and many, many others I think should be on the list. But really, it gets out of control. There are so many great writers that are writing in Texas and have written in Texas. But there are a couple that I know would not be disputed. And I already mentioned one of them, Walter P. Webb, and another is Roy Bedicek. And if you have heard of Webb and Bedicek, then you know the name of the Texas author that I would bet would battle McMurtry and Fehrenbach for the most popular Texas author title spot, J. Frank Dobie. And before I go on and keep saying J. Frank Dobie, and you're just going to be scratching your head saying, what's the J stand for and why didn't he use it? It wasn't anything weird like Julius or Jehediah or something like that. Is James Frank Dobie. He went by Frank, so J. Frank Dobie is the name we recognize and use. Dobie, Bedicek, and Webb were friends, and for quite a long time in the early 20th century, they were the big three of Texas letters. Webb was a historian who wrote books filled with big ideas, and Bedicek was an educator for most of his life and a naturalist that Webb and Dobie encouraged to write, and he wrote his first book when he was 70, and then he produced some others, and it's one of those things you wish he'd have started earlier, or maybe it's because the books were so good because he didn't, and he'd had the time to think and not just rush pen to paper. Regardless, the three of them were brought together by the University of Texas, and together they forged a friendship that lasted for decades during which they impacted Texas culture. And that influence annoyed some people. Webb and Dobie were fiercely independent and at times, well, most of the time, quite cantankerous. I've been looking at Texas historical works from the late 19th and early 20th century. And to me, it's evident that at that time, the focus of research in the identity of Texas was tied to the Republic era and the Civil War, with Texas firmly rooted in its southernness, its southern identity. And it's also apparent to me that it was the works of folks like Herbert Eugene Bolton, who was at University of Texas briefly, and Walter P. Webb, and especially J. Frank Dobie, along with others, that helped shift the Texas identity and the focus of the myth and mystique to the Southwest and the West. Now, Larry McMurtry, who himself was quite cantankerous. He had some opinions, some big opinions. I still feel bad for anybody that lives in Dallas if they've ever heard any of his statements concerning that city. But long before his 1985 masterpiece branded his place in Texas letters, he wrote an essay on Southwestern literature that unfortunately leaned so heavily into typical McMurtry unsentimental criticism with snarky shots at the big three that it had to have swayed at least a few people away from diving into their works. I know his opinions colored my thoughts on their works. I was in the big McMurtry phase of my reading life when I came across it, and for quite a while his opinion was gold. Years later, I realized that I shouldn't have let him hold such power over my reading choices and decisions. The essay was in McMurtry's 1968 collection, In a Narrow Grave, and it was written when he was a young, up-and-coming author in his early 30s, wanting to establish himself as something different than the old guard. I recommend that book and many of his other works, but be prepared for some harsh and unfortunately well-earned opinions of the Lone Star State. Belichick had died in 1959, followed by Webb in 1963. Dobie, the last of the big three, joined them in the great beyond in 1964. And in 1968, McMurtry wrote that outside of Texas, Belichick was unknown to the world, and the outside world hadn't read Webb and wasn't particularly interested in Dobie. And he might have been right for a time. I think he must have thought that with their deaths, their writings would, but their writings are all still on bookshelves, and they have made an impact beyond Texas, and their words are still being read in Texas. So he wasn't right 100% with that. For what it's worth, my opinion is that their works are still worthy of readers' attention. And despite McMurtry's critique, you can still find some of their works in most of the bookstores of Texas that also carry Lonesome Dove and Lone Star. They have endured, despite what the sage of Archer City once wrote, and Dobie might have the best representation on bookstore and library bookshelves. Despite his melancholic appraisal of Texas and the Southwest literary achievement up until the late 1960s, I would be wrong to say that it was all a negative view by McMurtry. Despite his attempt at dispassionate criticism, the strength of their best writings could not be ignored even by him. McMurtry singled out two of Dobie's works as his favorites, Tongues of Monty and Guide to Life and Literature of the Southwest. More on the second in a little while. Dobie biographer Stephen L. Davis has shown evidence that both McMurtry and Cormac McCarthy relied heavily on Dobie's books, as did many other writers. In the 1942 edition of his Guide to Life and Literature of the Southwest, Dobie wrote, "Certainly, one will have to go up the trail to Montana to finish the story of the Texas cowboy." And wasn't that the goal of McMurtry that he said in the 1980s when he wrote Lonesome Dove, that he was going to end the cowboy story by telling it as it was? And he wrote the classic Lonesome Dove and instead helped spread and enhance the myth of the Texas cowboy. And McCarthy, according to Davis, who works at the Whitliff collection that is home to McCarthy's works, can show firsthand evidence where McCarthy went so far as to come close to copying some sentences almost word for word into his published novels. I read quite a bit of Dobie when I was young, but fell away from attending to his words later on, partly because of McMurtry, but he doesn't carry all the blame. And I regret that because there are many treasures in the works of J. Frank Dobie. And as a character himself, he is worth learning about due to the stances he took, the thoughts he held, and the life he led. He was a fascinating person that I wish were here today to share his ideas and opinions about what's going on in Texas and in the world. Now, the best biography of Dobie is probably Stephen L. Davis's J. Frank Dobie, A Liberated Mind. And the best introduction to his writing and thoughts is a book that Davis edited, The Essential J. Frank Dobie. Texas A&M Press published it in 2019. And to be fully open here and clear, they were kind enough to send me a copy to evaluate for free. It is a masterpiece and serves as the best way to get into the work and the mind of the life of the man J. Frank Dobie. That's my opinion. And it's not because they gave it to me for free. I liked it so much that I purchased both the audio and ebook edition so that I would always be able to access its pages with my eyes and my ears. Another bonus feature concerning the audiobook version, it is narrated by the great Texas writer W.F. Strong, and his voice grants a special, ineffable quality to Dobie's work that was edited by Stephen Davis, and I will share more about the book in the future. The skeleton view of J. Frank Dobie is that he was a folklorist from Texas that lived from 1888 to 1964. But there was more to him than that. Leo Tolstoy and Mark Twain were still alive during Dobie's first 22 years of life. And along with the other members of the Big Three, Webb and Bedichek, Dobie was a contemporary of Texas-born author Catherine Ann Porter. He was also a contemporary of Robert Frost, Virginia Woolf, Franz Kafka, William Faulkner, Ernest Hemingway, John Steinbeck, T.S. Eliot, D.H. Lawrence, James Joyce, William Butler Yeats, Marcel Proust, Vladimir Nabokov, and Dobie's friend Carl Sandburg. And if McMurtry's point in 1968 was there were no Texas authors that had put anything out comparable to these people's works, he might have a point, but I don't necessarily think it's 100%. Each of these people pursued their own creative pathways that led some to fame and fortune, while Dobie found his own creative work focusing on the land and people of Texas, Mexico, and the Southwest. One notable fact that might come as a surprise is that he was also contemporary of Zane Grey, a pulp Western novelist you might not have heard of now, but who was a precursor to the great Louis L'Amour in the Western novel tradition. And Gray's books outsold the works of literary greats F. Scott Fitzgerald, James Joyce, Ernest Hemingway, and William Faulkner combined. Now, if you've heard of J. Frank Dobie, then it is probably because of his books on Texas and the Southwest. And these books are mostly why he is still remembered. He was a folklorist. That's what you will have heard. And he was, but he wasn't. He was more. He was more than just a folklorist. Not that there's anything wrong with being a folklorist. He was an author, a writer of books, essays, stories, and newspaper columns. Walter P. Webb joked that Dobie could sell the same story to more different magazines than anyone he ever knew. And Dobie was an editor, a lecturer, and a teacher. And he was also, according to Harry Ransom, a genius in the rare art of eloquent silence. Ransom also said that Dobie looked like Robert Frost or his friend Carl Sandburg, and his thinking was more influenced by Socrates and Plato, and his writing was more influenced by John Milton than anything or anyone Texan. Dobie was an individualist and a believer in freedom and a fighter for freedom. He was a philosopher. He was influenced by William Hazlitt, W.H. Hudson, Gilbert White of Selborne, John Stuart Mill, the Bible, Shakespeare, Isaac Walton, Richard Francis Burton, Charles Lamb, Thomas Carlyle, Henry David Thoreau, and the land, and the people that were a part of the land. He contemplated putting together a book entitled Emancipation of the Human Mind that included sections on Emerson, Jefferson, Thoreau, Tom Paine, Newton, Matthew Arnold, Voltaire, and Goethe. Harry Ransom, a faculty member, president, and ultimately chancellor of the University of Texas system, wrote one of the best descriptions of Dobie. It was in an introduction to Mary Louise McVicker's 1968 book, The Writings of J. Frank Dobie. Funny how so many things in this are from 1968. McVicker's book on the writings of J. Frank Dobie, Lone Star, was published in 1968, and McMurtry decided to take his shot at Texas and Texas writers in 1968. But Ransom wrote, "In the future of criticism now beginning, Dobie's volumes on the Longhorn, the Coyote, and the Mustang are likely to attract most attention and gain highest praise. His lyrical passage on the Mustang will be quoted more often, at least in classrooms and on official occasions, than anything else he wrote. The likelihood is double irony, good and bad. Good because, in the broadest sense, Dobie was a poet. Bad because this memorable manifesto on freedom may be mistaken for sentimental devotion, nostalgia, or prescriptive doctrine. The real mind and spirit of Frank Dobie as a man are reflected better in the Mustangs as a whole, in the companion books, and throughout a life of talk and written words not yet in print. By all of these, Dobie expressed his aspiration to freedom for himself and for every other human being. He attained that freedom in his thinking, maintained it, sometimes against formidable odds, in his living, and defended it unforgettably as an essential condition of all men who would stay fully alive. And there the quote by Ransom ends. Dobie was an intellectual, and he taught as a professor at the University of Texas, but he had little regard for doctoral degrees and kind of the academic system and games that you have to play at that level. He said the average PhD thesis is nothing but a transference of bones from one graveyard to another. Focus on getting enough footnotes to put in your work to show that you've done the research and help prove your point that you're trying to make. That statement might have more to do with his refusal to seek the recognition of a PhD himself and the idea that such a degree was unnecessary to do the work. It was just a recognition that you had accomplished something to him, perhaps. Considering his own work in folklore and intellectual activity, he was quite skilled in the transference of bones from one graveyard to another, but he didn't focus on the footnotes, and much of his work was tied to the preservation of memories and folkways. And in an early letter to his future wife, Dobie wrote, "Curse business, curse politics, curse the materialist world. There is in it nothing so ludicrously pedantic, unfair, and purely narrow as the petty jealousies and spelling bee standards of judgment to be found in academic circles." So yes, he made his living for a long while working in academic circles, but he did not buy into the ways things went, and that caused problems for him. Dobie believed education should widen its focus beyond classical and European civilizations, while also promoting the importance of regional studies, explaining if people are to enjoy their own lives, they must be aware of the significances of their own environments. Dobie's work also helped lay the groundwork for the avenue of study called social history that emerged decades after Dobie was stressing the importance of recording stories that, quote, expressed a social background and revealed, quote, the mind, the metaphor, and the mores of the common people. Dobie also illustrated that it was possible to make scholarly ideas available to a wider audience beyond academia, simply by writing with clarity. Dobie integrated the Texas Folklore Society in the 1920s by installing a Mexican-American woman, Jovita Gonzalez, as the society's president. She viewed the history of South Texas as a, quote, racial struggle. He followed this up in the 1930s by promoting the work of an African-American writer named J. Mason Brewer, who was also inducted into the Texas Folklore Society in the 1930s. Dobie did not just spend all of his time writing, reading, or teaching. He also went on adventures, experiencing the landscape he chronicled firsthand. He also collected stories firsthand, even meeting Texas cattleman legend Charles Goodnight. Dobie helped preserve by recording disappearing lifeways and the changing landscape, along with saving living creatures. His biographer, Stephen Davis, explained that Dobie even had a hand in preserving the longhorn cattle and bighorn sheep from extinction, and he was partially inspirational for the creation of Big Bend National Park and Padre Island National Seashore. And of course, McMurtry never touched on any of these things that I've talked about in his criticism. Not that Dobie was without flaws. We all have them, after all. And critics have pointed out correctly that some of his early writings were, like James McNutt says, apologies for Anglo oppression. Stephen Davis suggests that even with that being true, Dobie was still more progressive and sympathetic to Mexican Americans than his fellow Anglo writers in Texas and elsewhere. Davis thinks that as, quote, future generations of scholars find ways to more carefully examine the complexity of intercultural relations, many of Dobie's writings will appreciate and value because despite his lapses into cultural jingoism, much of his work also contains sharp glimpses of reality, end quote. Dobie faced off against the threats of abusive corporations and conservative politicians that he saw as threats to intellectual freedom and to freedom itself. Dobie stood for labor, free speech, and civil rights, and lost his job at the University of Texas when he openly called for integration of the school. He was born on a ranch in the South Texas county of Live Oak on September 26, 1888. The land and the life of the ranch and the people of the region shaped his character, personality, and helped influence his future interests. The written word was also an early influence on J. Frank Dobie. His father read the Bible aloud to the children, and his mother introduced them to Ivanhoe. She also introduced them to the Scottish chiefs, Pilgrim's Progress, and Swiss Family Robinson. At age 16, he moved to live with his maternal grandparents in Alice, Texas, to finish high school. And he started studying at Southwestern University in Georgetown in 1906. It is there that he met a young woman named Bertha McKee. They married 10 years later in 1916, and she would be an integral part of Dobie's work, going over almost every line and advising him on the, quote, never sufficiently accomplished art of omission, end quote. At Southwestern, he also met his English teacher, Professor Albert Ship Peages, or Pegas, depending on how you want to pronounce it. Professor Pegas introduced young Dobie to another love of his life, English poetry. He apparently especially showed interest in the Romantics. Pegas recognized something in the young man and encouraged him to write. And write he would. Dobie graduated from Southwestern University in 1910. And for 2 summers, he worked as a reporter, first for the San Antonio Express and next for the Galveston Tribune. He then went west to Alpine, Texas in 1910 to work as a teacher, but he was also principal, play director, and editor of the school newspaper. And he didn't stay there long, and he returned to Georgetown in 1911 to teach in the Southwestern University Preparatory School. He taught there until 1913, leaving to work on a master's degree at Columbia. After graduation from Columbia, he was hired to teach by the University of Texas in 1914. It was in this time period that he also became a member of the Texas Folklore Society. Both UT and the Society would play important roles in his life. After the United States entered the First World War, Dobie joined the Army and was trained in the field artillery branch. His outfit reached Europe at the end of the war and saw no combat, and he returned for his discharge in 1919 and returned to UT. Dobie began writing for the Texas Review, which is now called the Southwest Review, in 1919, and he continued to do that for the rest of his life. After publishing his first articles in 1919, Dobie resigned suddenly to manage his uncle Jim Dobie's ranch in 1920, and the year on the Rancho de los Olmos would prove to be especially important for his future work because during that time, he was again among the vaqueros on the land, herding cattle that he had known since birth, and in that setting he had a realization. He felt called to record and share, as Francis Edward Abernathy put it, quote, all the richness of this life and land and culture into literature, end quote. He returned to the University of Texas in Austin to pursue this mission, where he had access to the Texas Folklore Society and the rich Texas resources of the University of Texas Library. Returning, Dobie became secretary of the Texas Folklore Society in 1922 and he established a publication program. And from 1923, when their publication of Legends of Texas came out, to 1946, each year Dobie would oversee as editor the release of a new volume from the society. Dobie faced one dilemma. The University of Texas would not promote him so he could make more money without him earning a PhD. So he left and taught from 1923 to 1925 at Oklahoma A&M. And he only returned with a promotion at UT in 1925 due to the large help of friends at the Austin campus. He also wrote, and he wrote, and he wrote, and he wrote about Texas history. He wrote about culture. He wrote about folklore. And these works were published in magazines and periodicals. And then in 1929, he published his first book, A Vaquero of the Brush Country. And this was the beginning of his emergence as a spokesman for Texas and the culture of the Southwest. And it was a role that he embraced. And many books followed over the years. Coronado's Children in 1930, On the Open Range, 1931, Tongues of the Monte, that was a favorite of McMurtry, 1935, The Flavor of Texas, 1936, Tales of the Mustang, 1936, Apache Gold and Yaqui Silver, 1939, John C. Duval, The First Man of Texas Letters, 1939, The Roadrunner in Fact and Folklore, 1939, and The Longhorns, 1941. Also following the publication of his first book in the spring of 1930, and this is another highlight of his career in life, Dobie started a new course at UT, Life and Literature of the Southwest. The course was revolutionary and similar to the approach history professor Herbert Eugene Bolton had earlier developed, stressing what he thought was the proper approach to history, and that was a shift in focus. As the course developed over the next decade, by 1938, Dobie was informing students taking the class, the main aim of this course has been to come to a realization of the elements that have blended together to form the culture of the Southwest. And that involved not looking east, but looking at the land there and at the first peoples that lived there. Biographer Stephen Davis gives a really vivid and great description of this monumental course, and he wrote that students received an education unlike anything before. They had grown up believing that American history began with the arrival of the Pilgrims and the founding of the 13 colonies. Dobie aimed to set them straight. He pointed out that the city of San Antonio was established years before George Washington was born, and that Santa Fe, New Mexico, had been a territorial capital before the first pilgrim ever landed at Plymouth Rock. Though the Southwest had long been overlooked, Dobie argued it offered just as much relevant history as New England. And Dobie would show up in class he'd have a big briefcase stuffed with books, and he'd tell students to forget, quote, sermons of dreary New England preachers. Instead, Dobie wanted them to look at the story of Cabeza de Vaca, and this was unheard of. No English professor was talking about Cabeza de Vaca in the 1930s. Wasn't done. However, the story of the Spanish explorer has become an important part of the American canon. And now we know about it. Dobie's lectures covered a lot of subjects. He taught his students how to survive in the desert on prickly pear cactus, Davis says. And Davis also said he explained how to calm a nervous herd of longhorns during a lightning storm. Dobie also pointed out, according to Davis, the beneficial qualities of the mesquite tree. He wrote and said how you could stuff your hat with the leaves to keep cool or chew them for a headache. He brought samples of rawhide to show to the class, and he told wondrous tales about it. And Davis also points out another thing that Dobie did in this class. Quote, Dobie also encouraged his students to live their lives to the fullest. And on one of his end of the semester tests, he added a note, I hope you'll always be able to eat when you are hungry, and that you will be very hungry. That you'll always be able to drink when you are thirsty, and that you will often raise a powerful thirst, and that you'll really live until you die. Davis also wrote, many of his students, captivated by the wonders they discovered in Dobie's course, wanted to continue the journey. For them, Dobie developed a reading guide containing an extensive list of books organized by topic. He also added erudite, often charming observations on each title. He made mimeographed copies of the guide available to his class, and in 1931, the Southwest Press published a book, Finding Literature on the Texas Plains, which included Dobie's bibliography. He continued to expand his list, and a few years later, his Guide to Life and Literature of the Southwest was published as a standalone book. It remains one of his enduring works and is an essential volume for any Southwestern bookshelf. In 1939, Dobie began writing a Sunday newspaper column in which he shared his opinions, his thoughts on current events and other things in Texas. And he continued this until his death. The Handbook of Texas article on Dobie by Frank Abernathy summarizes the content of these columns. Quote, his most celebrated targets were professional educationists, quote, unctuous elaborators of the obvious, state politicians, quote, when I get ready to explain homemade fascism in America, I can take my example from the state capital of Texas. Pompeo Copini's Alamo Cenotaph, quote, from a distance it looks like a grain elevator or one of those swimming pool slides. And inappropriate architecture. A friend reports his saying that the University of Tower, into which he refused to move, looked like a toothpick in a pie ought to be laid on its side and have galleries put around it. His war against bragging Texans' political, social, and religious constraints on individual liberty and the mechanized world's erosion of the human spirit was continual, end quote. That's a really wonderful summation by Frank Abernathy. During the Second World War, Dobie taught American literature in Cambridge. He released a book on his UT course, Guide to Life and Literature of the Southwest, that we just talked about. And the experience of teaching in England provided fuel for another book, A Texan in England, that was published in 1945. Now, this experience in Cambridge was another turning point in his life. According to Abernathy, he said, quote, that it gave him a broader perspective, that it was his beginning of his acceptance of civilization, an enlightened civilization free of social and political rigidities, and with full respect for individuality. Following his open encouragement for integrating the University of Texas, along with other liberal views in 1946, Dobie found himself to be an enemy of Governor Coke Stevenson, a conservative politician. Dobie requested a continuation for his leave of absence from the University of Texas, but instead he was fired from the position in 1947. And so from there on, Dobie continued to live and live to the fullest. He continued to dedicate himself to writing and speaking his mind. Books came out, more books. The Seven Mustangs came out in 1948. The Voice of the Coyote came out in 1949. Ben Lilly Legend came out in 1950. The Mustangs, 1952. Tales of Old Time Texas, 1955. Up the Trail from Texas, 1955. I'll Tell You a Tale, 1960. And Cow People came out in 1964, the year of his death. And several other books came out after that, a lot of that due to Bertha McKee Dobie's efforts. Some Part of Myself came out in 1967. Rattlesnakes came out in 65. Out of the Old Rock, a really nice little book that Bertha worked on, came out in 1972. Prefaces came out in 75. Wild and Wily Range Animals came out in 1980. And of course, I've talked about The Essential J. Frank Dobie. That came out in 2019. Dobie's reputation at the end of his life covered a wide swath from love to hatred. The Southwestern Writers and the Texas Folklore Society lavished him with honors. The Austin American Statesman and the Texas Observer each published special editions filled with praise by admiring readers and friends. President Johnson awarded Dobie the Presidential Medal of Freedom, the highest civilian honor in the United States, on September 14, 1964. And Dobie died 4 days later, on September 18th, and his earthly remains are interred in the State Cemetery in Austin, not far from his friend Walter P. Webb. Yet, All did not like or respect or love Dobie. The FBI investigated him as a subversive threat. And upon hearing of his demise, an old friend, Kate O'Connor, wrote, J. Frank Dobie died in Austin, Texas, Friday, September 18th, 1964, unloved and unmourned because he defected to the enemy, communism. O'Connor was sadly wrong. Such sentiment did not dampen his legacy. He wasn't unloved. He wasn't unmourned. And every year, even today, every year on the first Friday since 2011, people gather to celebrate the life and words of Dobie at a literary event dubbed Dobie Dichos, where Texas writers and storytellers are invited to, quote, read from, discuss, debate, and or tell stories from the works of J. Frank Dobie on the grounds of the historic Oakville Jail located in Oakville, Texas, on IH-37 in Live Oak County. And that's the county that Dobie was born in. And the list of some participants illustrate modern Texas generations of creative authors that are heirs to Dobie and the rest of the big three, including some that probably weren't around in 1968 for McMurtry to stop at. List includes William Jack Sibley, Bill Whitliff, Jan Reed, John Philip Santos, Elizabeth Crook, Naomi Shihab Nye, Stephen Davis, W.C. Jameson, Brandon Schuler, Rick Casey, Nan Kuba, Joe Nick Petoskey, Sarah Bird, Mike Cox, Andy Wilkinson, Jenny Brown, Ito Romo, Retha Oliver, Andre Tiarina, Carmen Tafola, Bruce Shackelford, Mary Locke Crofts, Lon Taylor, Ann Weisbarger, Kip Stratton, Dr. Robert Flynn, Stephen Harrigan, Sarah Cortez, Fran Vick, Kurt House, Carrie Clack, Diana Lopez, Louis F. Fisher, Paulette Giles, Chip Dameron, Sergio Troncoso, Celeste Walker, Norma Cantu, Eldrana Duma, Mark Busby, Stephen Harden, W.F. Strong, Ken Roberts, Mike Blakely, I love Mike Blakely's books, David Bowles, Wes Ferguson, Christina Downs, Heath Dollar, and James Wade. Now that's a list of people. If you need something to read, go throw a dart into that list and pick one of those people's books. I've read works from some of them. Paulette Giles, like I said, Mike Blakely, great, W.F. Strong, and Mike Cox, Stephen Harrigan, Stephen Harden, great historian, and some others. There's a lot of great writing, and it's a reading list for modern Texas writing right there. There you go. And they all have gathered together to celebrate Dobie. But Dobie still has his critics, and that's a good thing as well. He did not believe in restricting ideas, I don't think. He believed in writing about, fighting, and speaking out against bad ideas. Debate is a healthy thing. In his biography of Dobie, Stephen Davis sums up some of the criticism like this. Highly praised during his lifetime, he has been attacked by legions of critics since his death. His rallying cry was always authenticity, yet he approached his native region with romanticism that unwittingly contributed to the same Wild West stereotypes he railed against. Although he claimed deep friendships with Texas Mexican vaqueros, his view of race relations was complicated by his fealty to Anglo-American culture, and Chicano scholars have since accused him of jingoism. He consistently demanded the highest level of achievement in other writers, and yet his own prose sometimes reads, as one critic complained, as if it had bored him to write it. And in 1981, the great Larry McMurtry took another shot at Dobie, saying the man's writing was a congealed mass of virtually undifferentiated anecdotage, endlessly repetitious, thematically empty, structureless, and carelessly written. Talking about a low blow, everything that he wrote was not gold or even silver or bronze level writing, but he did have it in him to produce work that was platinum level. Stephen Davis, in a kinder critique, said Dobie was, quote, was often casual with his prose, but his writing could also be magnificent. And Davis also added, despite his flaws as a writer, Dobie succeeded in capturing vital aspects of Texas's past that would have otherwise been lost. His books helped nourish future generations of authors, such as Larry McMurtry, who freely adapted his tales into their work. Dobie also mentored dozens of younger writers, men, women, Mexican Americans, and African Americans, who went on to significant accomplishments of their own. And one of Dobie's harshest critics was Mexican American scholar Americo Paredes. He once told an interviewer, "I found him to be a very lovable old fraud." Dobie biographer Stephen L. Davis wrote, even though Paredes, quote, produced the most scathing literary portrait of Dobie in existence, he also sang a song in the old man's honor after his death. And that perfectly illustrates a dichotomy of J. Frank Dobie. Dobie was not a saint, nor should he be treated as one, but at his best he could represent the best of us. No one knew him better than his beloved wife, Bertha McKee Dobie, and she said, "I should say that in Frank, pig, charging bull, and mule together make a half, and that the other half is humanity at its very finest." Dobie believed in freedom and intellectual independence. It bothered many in authority, especially at the university setting, that he was so independent. Many loved him as a person while despising the fact that they could not control him. And that fierce independent streak is one of the elements firmly embedded in the ground rock of the Texas mystique. And now I reach the reasons for this long look at J. Frank Dobie. First, if any of this is of interest to you, then I encourage you to find a copy of Texas A&M Press's The Essential J. Frank Dobie, edited, as I've said many times, Stephen L. Davis. It was the inspiration for my own closer consideration of Dobie and his work. And then go get a copy of Davis's biography of Dobie. It is a fantastic and fair work. Second, I intend to go through Dobie's book that grew out of his life and literature of the Southwest course at the University of Texas that bears the name Guide to Life and Literature of the Southwest. And McMurtry's 1968 critique of the Big Three and other Texas writers, including his own contemporaries, is reminiscent of the response Dobie received when he first proposed the course. Dobie's English department colleagues objected because they believed Texas and the Southwest had little literature worthy of attention. McMurtry basically regurgitated their opinion in 1968. Dobie's response was priceless, and this is one of the things I love about the guy. "It has plenty of life, I'll teach that." And much of the literature that we consider great captures just that, the beauty and the magic and horror and complexities of life. As Frank Wardlaw wrote in a foreword to an edition of Coronado's Children, he said, "Life and literature, while not always synonymous, were closely linked in the thinking of this remarkable man." And he was a remarkable man for his time. And he'd be a remarkable man now. Consider what he wrote in the introduction to Cow People. "All of us live in debt to each other. Human nature is so healthy that few are oppressed by the feeling of debt. And we need that today. It is a recognition of something, a part of something, what many of us lack: empathy, seeking to understand, knowledge." But I digress. And, I'm indebted to Larry McMurtry. Aside from all that I have enjoyed in his writing, it is thanks to McMurtry and his criticism of Dobie that I learned that Dobie did not copyright the book in either of its publications in 1942 and 1952 because he wanted the knowledge to exist beyond the classroom and the text itself. So I will be going through it, starting, I think, with the next episode. An interesting discovery I've made by looking at Dobie is that he did not believe in a zoomed-in tight focus on Texas and the Southwest simply for the sake of Texas exceptionalism. And I find that interesting because I feel similar about that, what I'm doing when I'm studying Texas history and doing the podcast. It's a gateway to understanding Texas and its place in the broader world. And that's always behind everything I'm trying to think about. He wrote, "Nobody should specialize on provincial writings before he has a perspective that only a good deal of good literature and wide history can give." I named this episode A Texan's Guide to Life, kind of as a joke, kind of as a play on words about the fact that he had a guide to life and literature of the Southwest. The episode's about a Texan, J. Frank Dobie, and I don't know if he ever wrote a guide to life, but he did have his course on life and literature of the Southwest. And to close, in the end, I realized that perhaps Dobie did leave us a guide to life with his life and with the things he wrote and fought. And ultimately, it's in the epitaph that he wrote for his gravestone that's in the Texas State Cemetery. You can see it for yourself at Republic Hill, Section 1, Row F, number 23. On the one side, it reads information about Bertha, who lived 10 years longer than her husband. James Frank Dobie, 1888-1964, storyteller of the Southwest, Presidential Medal of Freedom. His wife, Bertha McKee Dobie, 1890-1974. She was ever loyal. And then, on the opposite side, are A Texan's Guide to Life. I have come to value liberated minds as the supreme good of life on earth.
At Sierra, discover top workout gear at incredible prices, which might lead to another discovery. Your headphones haven't been connected this whole time. Awkward. Discover top brands at unexpectedly low prices. Sierra, let's get moving.
You know that feeling when someone shows up for you just when you need it most? That's what Uber is all about. Not just a ride or dinner at your door. It's how Uber helps you show up for the moments that matter. Because showing up can turn a tough day around or make a good one even better. Whatever it is, big or small, Uber is on the way. So you can be on yours. Uber, on our way.
And with that, we're going to close this out. I enjoyed and learned a lot by looking at the life and work of J. Frank Dobie. I want to reiterate that Stephen L. Davis's two books, The Essential Dobie and The Biography of Dobie, are essential reading for Texas History Lessons listeners. Thanks for listening. Thanks for Derek McClendon for providing the theme music. Take care of yourselves. Take care of each other. Be kind. Adios.